to let you know about some other activities in terms of today. This session is going to be pre-recorded, and the transcription process has been started. And to give you a good idea of how Copilot works and everything else, and this is all about things you need to do from a planning standpoint. A little bit about KAMIND IT, for those that don't know us. Basically, we're one of the cloud-first companies, and what that really means is that we're one of the original born-in-the-cloud companies with Microsoft, and we've been managing and selling Office 365 from the early days when it was known as BPOS to the first version of 365 and how it is extended now to what it is. And it's really exciting about the changes that have been happening. Myself, we're also at KAMIND. We're basically a certified CMC certified partner. We're one of the 500 partners in the CMC ecosystem that is certified as a level 1 assessor. And we're also a provider of GCC high licenses and services, and soon to be Copilot as well, into the Defense Department industrial community. So that's really exciting times right now. And this session today that we're talking about, this is all about Copilot. And there's two sides of it. It's the why it's important to get started. But what I wanted to really talk about today is the security implementations and what you have to worry about and look forward in terms of Copilot. And those that don't know Copilot, give you some brief introduction to this. This is really exciting. If you see what's really happening in the industry and you're seeing it into the web and everything else, basically how fast the adoption has happened. And you look in terms of AI technology and what happened with ChatGPT, and just in a feeling of just literally looking at 3 months, what has happened. And for ourselves, we basically have provisioned Copilot in terms of for all our employees here at KAMIND. And it's been interesting too for myself. One of the things I do is I publish a weekly CEO letter about what we're doing for the next week and our future process. That would normally take me about 2 hours to do, 2 to 3 hours a week to do. Once Copilot, and I'm starting using Copilot, I'm actually able to reduce my time to less than an hour in producing this weekly email that I send out to my team. So that's the type of things that's going to happen. And when you start looking at Copilot, it's really looking at how do you actually take a different perspective on things. Now, there's some statistics that Microsoft has, and I just want to get this really about where us as leaders, as business leaders in our organization, look at Copilot. 87% of us believe that, Copilot or AI will give you a competitive edge. And that's really important because it is a competitive edge. And when you actually understand, I'll go through some of the details for this as we get through some of the securities considerations. Microsoft has a relation with OpenAI, and part of that relationship allows them to move that large language model into your 365 tenant. And that also allows it to be built out. And they're doing the same thing in the Department of Defense tenants for GCC High. And it's really the opportunity in terms of what it does allows us in terms of business side of it to really look at what we're doing. It's an enormous opportunity for all of us to basically improve our ability to do things, make us more productive, how we share information, and how we basically look at how to get the pieces done. And when using this, I've been using it now religiously for I would say since it was released on January 16th, it has really affected in terms of our ability, how we actually can put information out, how we have better, more accurate information that we put in place. And it really is what Microsoft calls the assistant. And that's what it actually has. So those that don't know Copilot real quick, let me just walk through, give you the quick overview video that we actually have in terms of Copilot. And you should all be hearing this in terms of the speakers and everything else. There's one interesting thing that I always find in that video. They say that, they have this situation where it says, let's go generate a SWOT analysis against our competitors. One of the things that you have the ability to do with Copilot on the configuration, that's why security is so important, you can actually configure Copilot to actually data mine competitors' websites if you want to. So when you actually do a SWOT analysis, you can actually do a SWOT analysis, pull information from your website, pull information from competitors, do a compare and contrast those pieces. Never before we had the ability to do those things. Now, that's the type of stuff that you actually have. And when we get right back down to it, one of the things that Copilot is based on in terms of 365, it really is based on a series of trusts. In terms of Microsoft runs on trust. Their philosophy is that data is your data. If data is publicly available, yeah, go data mine it, use it in fine-tuning how you do things. But the data that you have inside your organization should be used just for your organization and not to be used to train some of the foundation model. And so the structure that Microsoft has in terms of Copilot is that the data is actually protected. And that's super important to understand what compliance and security controls really mean. Like in our case at KAMIND, we have a dual environments or dual commercial environments we support. We support the commercial environments in terms of commercial IT. We also support the government in terms of defense contractors, where the mission is very focused in terms of what we deliver for that, because we have a deliverable objective for the companies we support in terms of how the troops and the forces in the government that we actually support for. So trust is important. Data security and data sovereignty is important. So when you look at AI and you look at situations as an MSSP, we're seeing cases where we're seeing ChatGPT, other types of form of AI being used by different clients, and we're really focusing those to try to make sure data is protected. With the Microsoft Copilot, we don't have to worry about that because the data is restricted to your 365 organization. So when you think about 365, there's really 4 components that you think about AI in general. Let me give you some AI basics. This will make more sense in a few minutes. You have the large language model, which is basically in the Microsoft world, this is actually the Semantic engine that we have. So the large language model and ChatGPT, that's the overall community. You have the Microsoft Graph, which is your data, the internet, and the Microsoft apps. And how all that fits in, it basically is how this is all structured. So when you look at the Microsoft Graph, that's the data entity that basically has the information about your organization, about your usage, about emails, about all types of activity. That's what the graph is. And basically, when Copilot is actually used and grounded, what Microsoft is referring to, it's only data, looking at data from your organization, what they can do and not do, based on the security permissions, and based on the data. It's used basically for the organization only. And the one little interesting piece on this one, if you notice on the far right-hand side, is they talk about the semantic engine, semantic index. Semantic index is an interesting concept because what Microsoft has done, the semantic index is basically the clone of the large language model inside of your 365 tenant. So when you actually start using Copilot, why it's important to get started as soon as you can, because you want to start training and learning and training your team to basically start using and actually getting data and start thinking outside the box. And this is really important to basically start building this model in your tenant for the indexing that you need to go through. So when you, like in this examples here, when you're looking at what Copilot is all about prompting. So in this case is that you want to include results for a property shipment in terms of ship room. You start looking queries that you actually want to have and how you're going to put queries on the industry. So you try to think things from organizational document experts, how you wanted to search. You have to change the way you are actually asking questions to get information that you want. And that's really important in terms of Copilot on the pieces because you have to learn that. And then when you look at the semantic index, what it is it's that entity that sits on top of the Microsoft graph to basically draw the connection, draw the pieces together so you get better information pulled together. That's super important. Now, here's a quick little video about the semantic index to give you an
Semantic
idea what
Index
it
for
does.
Copilot creates a sophisticated map of your personal and company data, identifying relationships and making important connections. In fact, your brain works like a semantic index by encoding multiple words and pictures to create a larger conceptual map of information. For example, a semantic map of what the average person knows about elephants would include things like elephants have trunks, and elephants travel in herds, and elephants live in Africa. Today, people are mostly familiar with keyword search, which relies on exact words and phrases. So, when you search for March sales report, you get a list of documents that include exactly those 3 words. But a semantic index understands that sales reports are produced by Kelly on the finance team and published each month as an Excel file. And it encodes all of these concepts and relationships between concepts in vectors in the index. Semantic Index for Copilot analyzes your data. That's all your emails, documents, calendar, chats, and more in the Microsoft Graph, and uses a large language model, or LLM, to map all your content and the relationships between your content and you, searching through billions of vectors to find the most relevant results in milliseconds. It's what enables Microsoft 365 Copilot to deliver personalized, relevant, and actionable responses, and do so in a secure, compliant, privacy-preserving way. Semantic Index for Copilot enables every organization to be AI ready.
So that gives you an idea of what the semantic index does. And now you see the relationship between the large language model. So in 365 tenant, in your 365 tenant, you are building the relationship. You're building that index that you're used to query and find information about it. In order for that to actually work correctly, it's based on this whole foundation principle in terms of what you have, in terms of what is the security structure, what's the compliance, the privacy, and also Microsoft responsible AI in terms of what they actually handle in terms of what's fair and right. But you're looking in terms of the tenant, the groups of people, the individuals, and the permission model. And there's additional terms of security controls that Microsoft has enabled depending on your subscriptions, as such example of Purview. And what Purview is fundamental part of the Microsoft 365 Copilot. And what this means is that what Purview really does is a compliance management tool so now you can actually label data. What data do you want internal to the organization? What data are you going to allow to go external? What type of DLP, data loss prevention policies, do you create to basically block information from being retrieved or harvested by bad actor? And really the key thing is you've got to really understand what you actually have. So when you look at, and we're all the same, is that we collect things over time. It's amazing how much mail or documents that we actually have. But you're looking at the pieces, what you're trying to do is you're trying to really build a foundation for data security and compliance. And that's really the key parts when you actually look in terms of what Purview does. Now, Purview information protection, when you look at the simplest things of it, it has what we call sensitivity labels. Now, sensitivity labels is really important in commercial space in terms of intellectual property, HIPAA information, PHI information, and PII. You want to protect those and label those in an organization. In our defense contractor space, we add another one. We add in terms of FCI, federal contract information, or we add CUI, confidential and classified information, which are regulatory requirements. And we put sensitivity labels on these things to actually manage it. And it's a process to go through, because what you're trying to do when you actually manage information, you're trying to structure in terms of what you can actually have, apps can have, what can be done in desktop devices, how that information is distributed external to the organization. Can it be actually used in third-party services? There's data controls that you need to put in place. And if you look at any type of data breach or what's going on with vendors, it's all about trying to basically circumvent the structure. So basically you end up in a situation where you have data leak or data loss. So you have to you have to start looking at how do you actually manage information in the organization. And DLP is actually sensitivity labels using, and DLP is part of that. Now, Copilot actually uses all that information to basically give the information for the right folks to make sure people have access to it. And you have to keep in mind that 365 in general is a collaboration platform, and it's built in with built-in security and compliance, security built at the lowest level. And what Copilot is really doing is extending those. Now, what does that really look at from a data perspective? And this was a handy Venn diagram that was put together and really kind of puts the whole idea of what Copilot does and doesn't do. And it really comes down to this three tenet. Do you have permission to see the content? Is the contact has the contact been indexed by the semantic index? Do you have permissions to access a sensitivity label? So now you have, looking in terms of your organizations, you're stepping back and saying, okay, what type of data structures do I need to put in place, and what type of organization structures to make sure that when we deploy Copilot, it returns the results that expected? So that's really the key portion of it that you look at. And data security is crucial in terms of how the permission models is put in place. So that the way Microsoft has structured and what they're recommending is so you don't unintentionally leak data between user groups and tenants. So you have to understand the pieces. Now, what's happened in 365 for a number of years is people have, we haven't been really paying attention to global admin. People have rights that they don't have rights. And we have to start stepping up and saying, okay, what rights does people have? Do you have a need to know? It kind of corny when you use the need to know type attitude, but that's what you have to look at. You look at information in terms of what privacy policies that you need to put in place on it. And to understand the pieces of it gives you an idea of how Copilot actually works in the architecture. Because when you actually talk about the various pieces of it in the various stage, it's an iterative process that Copilot uses. And what we're going to do is we're going to walk through this process in terms of, like, when a compliance is grounding, a query is grounding, a prompt is grounding, what actually happens during the next steps. For example, you start following the best practices for data 365 data security. What data access do you have? What data protection? What is the data lifecycle that it actually has in the organization? And how does the Copilot architecture handle it? And then when you actually look in terms of building the prompts, and the prompts are what really make the Copilot engine works, it's what is the prompts that you actually need to put? How do you actually get the right answers? How do you actually build the engine? How do you make a traceability? And then how do you implement from a practical sense in these different scenarios? Now, looking in terms of the way this architecture, and this kind of makes more sense as you see the pieces of it, it's really trying to look at best practices. It's trying to figure out, okay, we have data access, you have data protection, you have data lifecycle. Are we oversharing documents more than what we should? Do I have the necessary mechanisms in place to protect my current documents? Should some of the data silos, should they exist? How much data do we actually have, and is it really relevant to the organization? These are questions that you ask, and when you start looking at terms of how they impact the organization, you start saying that, okay, now we have to make some changes. Do we have a really good way to manage public and private sites? Do we manage site permissions? And do we have a way to review those permissions for access? At the same time, for identify, which type of who has access to what, and how do we actually limit the access to the documents? And also, what is our policy on getting rid of documents? Do we just create yet another team site and yet another SharePoint site that sits idle for years and no one's looked at it? These are all the aspects that you have to look in terms of how you do security. And a lot of this is based on the license types that you actually have. And a lot of license type for the advanced security management has to be the E3s or the E5s because that has a compliance architecture built into it. In the process you go through, you look in terms of, got to ask the questions, got to ask the policies, you got to ask the questions on how to do things and how to basically get the best practices in place. And how do you actually manage those things so that when do you actually move public groups to private? When do you actually implement container labeling? Like you can 365, for instance, you can assign a label to a team. So if a team is only a certain level of confidential, if that's one of your sensitivity label, you can assign that to a team, to a SharePoint site. So you build some of the fundamental structures with it. And you can actually look in terms of different types of data, then build that wall in terms of what type of controls you want to put in place. These are the things that you need to do. And you're looking using the different Microsoft tools, in terms of how 365, Purview, and Entra and Syntax works. It gives you the ability to basically manage that activity. And that's what you actually have to look in your organization. And it doesn't really matter how big or small you are. These are fundamental concepts and fundamental things that you have to put in place to basically manage information. Because as we go through as AI, we're seeing the impact of AI. We're also going to see the impact in terms of how the efficiency of the organization and how people productivity is going to increase. And it's all about data access. Do people have access to the right data that they actually need to do their job? And you look in different cases on it, and it all comes down to the document side of it. And it all comes down to what people actually have. And so when you manage like Copilot usage over time, you want to actually see how people are doing things in terms of what they need to do. Do you have, what type of limit access do they have to the Copilot engine? How do you monitor the interaction? How do you actually basically integrate the classification? How do you actually do those things necessary that people can do their jobs? And how do you actually constantly move forward? And that's really the secret of it, because there's measures in Copilot that are designed to improve efficiencies and utilization. But you have to start somewhere, and where you start is with your document classification on it. And that's where you put the best practices and manage the data, and then you put the governance structure that you need in place. Like in a case of any organization that is going through in terms of changes that we're seeing from the Department of Defense side with the NIST 800-171 standard, which is more of a data security standard, you're seeing that now moved over into more the rest of the federal and state government. Those type of controls are being put in place because it's all about data management. And it's all about making sure you can manage the information, stay on top of it. Now, what I've done in terms of how to look at some of this stuff, I put together some scenarios to give an idea of different types of people in your organization, what they would have from a security standpoint. In this case, you'd have a trainee that leverages Copilot generate like an internship report. So in essence, the first time they look at the trainee, do they have access to sensitive information? Is the documents they're accessing already basically restructured? And then basically you can actually limit the access. These are governance controls that you can put in place. And then you can actually go through and monitor those in action, look for the data leaks, look for the sensitivity labels that have been accessed, and you can actually look at the company strategy. And it all comes down to how you audit and manage this. So in our managed security programs, for instance, in our Fortress G, we do these things as necessary. As we put the DLP and the document sensitivities in place, we manage those type of infrastructure and manage that audit capability. At the same time, if you're doing your own type of security management and compliance, you need to manage those things as well and look in terms of how is the DLP set up? How is the Copilot management? How is the document sensitivities manage it? And manage it according to your compliance states of the organization. You have the same thing when you look in terms of dealing with, this is a case of patent applications, same type of idea. You have issues in terms of what sites you start restricting sites that folks have access to internally so you control information. It's the same concept, is that you're looking at, and then you're looking at other ideas. What type of prompts do you use? If you see a certain type of prompt being generated, do you actually go in and basically look, and is that an early warning flag that you have an issue? Those are the capabilities when you actually look at how Purview manages things. So you get access to information and you understand what people are doing. And you can see from even another one, which is a more common one that you run into, is like, you have people looking at compensation. Granted, there's different issues that so with different parts of the states and country has different requirements, But basically you're saying, okay, what data should be protected? Like, is the HR data really has been protected? Does the fact that that an individual prompts for a salary related prompt generates alert? Do you actually have the Purview structure set up to configure that way? And do you basically communicate internally about other preventions in terms of addressing users so it doesn't become more of an HR issue? But you can actually go through and you start looking for information. You're looking using your compliance organizations and your to basically say what gets flagged, what is acceptable in the organization, what is not acceptable. And this is super important because acceptable is business risk. It comes down to what is the business risk that an organization wants to have, and how the controls and compliance controls define the maturity of the organization and the business risks that the organization is willing to take in information. And you can also have in terms of documents for employees, you can monitor data for leaks, you can monitor sensitivity changes. These are things that you think about in terms of how you actually access information. The world has really changed in terms of AI. And as we look at our 365 organizations, how we configure them and how we manage it is everything. We have to manage not only the cybersecurity side of it, we have to manage the compliance side of it and basically do the necessary monitoring to actually see how the different scenarios work with employees. And the questions that people ask me all the time is, what type of common rules do I follow? Well, how do you really get started with this? And that's the big question. Well, the real secret, you start some of the basics. You start with SharePoints and Teams. You check which sites are public, which sites are private, should they be blocked, who has access to it. Those are the things that you actually look at. And you take an idea in terms of what type of controls do you put in your organization so information stays private. Another example that you have is then one is that it's a very common one that you need to put in place, but there is what we call expiration policy for inactive teams and group sites. So when you actually create a 365 group site, you set an expiration policy so that the site is basically, if it's not being used for 120 days or 200 days or 10 years, whatever your number is, you have an expiration date associated with it, so that site would automatically archive itself and not be available. Now, when you're looking at data and data management, these are things that you have to change your process and make your environment more secure. So just as a rule of thumb, when you create a group now, always put a default expiration policy in place in terms of your IT policies in 365. Don't allow groups created without a default policy. And then the other aspect is that when you look at access, you can actually review the access in Microsoft Entra ID, and you can manage relationships. So you can actually see when people are requesting access, what is the process that you put in place to basically go root? Do you have a change control board that basically approves processes? These are the things that you do. Now, you are looking at it saying, well, geez, this is a lot of work. I'm putting a lot of the compliance pieces in. I don't want to do that. The interesting thing is when you start putting more structure and compliance, you do it in such a way that you want to have agility for the organization. Compliance and structure, what it does is actually helps the organization focus and be able to deliver the services and products that they're really designed to do. So the more that people know how to do things, the more they know where their guardrails are, the more they know the organization structure, the more efficient that the organization is going to be, and the more efficient the organization can do in learning. So what's happening with Copilot is a wake-up call for all of our businesses to really sit down and say, what's really important? What do people have access to? What do you need to do your job? And how do you actually do things to make sure things be focused? And it's these other aspects that you actually have when you go through Copilot, the other pieces that you want to look at in terms of what do you not want to have indexed. So as you put things in being indexed or not being indexed, you have ability to basically turn off search in different sites. For instance, when we actually, in our implementation of Copilot, we have started enabling certain sites specifically to basically do searching in our document archives. So we enable people to actually find information and actually build it so they can actually do the things they need to do. And that's when you talk about security, when you talk about the pieces, it starts at the top, and you have to ask yourself, as an organization, how do I want to provide information? Which information is really restricted to those that need to know? How do I want to put those pieces together? And how do I want to make sure I have the right security pieces to make sure the bad actors, those external to my organization, don't get access to it? Those are key questions that you need to ask. And those are questions in security when you talk about Copilot. Now, you talk about what Microsoft Copilot is. I mean, there's tons of them. There's more every day that's being created. In terms of what's happening in the 365 Copilots, for instance, you have in terms of the Power Platform, which is basically what we call Copilot Studio, and all sorts of different business copilots that are being put together for, and there's even one coming out for LinkedIn and Xbox for those who are Xbox players. And so you see a lot of things going. It's about AI is that tool to use. The question is, how do we actually use it? And how do we actually make sure that the impact that we're using is doing it? And what I found ourselves in our use of it, yeah, we have more effective meetings, we got better data analysis, and we have content control, what we have. But the interesting one I have when I look at it in terms of meetings, because I have my inbox is really full, it's basically be able to process and look for information, prepare myself for my Monday meeting, prepare myself for my various team meetings. That's super, super important that you're seeing it. And you're seeing other aspects in terms of business metrics of personal productivity. You're seeing different things that really help. It's about trying to improve the quality of product that we produce and improve our productivity. And we're seeing both of those across the board. The piece that we're at now is that we have to put the necessary security controls to make sure that not all information is accessible by all people. That's the nature of it. That's the nature of business. Some information needs to be restricted to the business and different people in the organizations. And that's what you need to do so people can be more productive doing the things that they're supposed to do. And the key part of that is really looking at Purview as a foundational part of the 365. And that's really the whole piece of it when you actually talk about compliance management and different strategies and licenses. And yeah, we've seen a lot of folks and say, I just want an Office, Business Basic or an Office E3 license. And they don't really look at some of the other conditional access, the other type of functions for Purview in terms of compliance, things you need to do. The issue is that as you look at security and compliance in an organization, you need to put these additional things in place to actually manage it. Now, how do you get started with all this? That's the questions that we're asked all the time. And it's really, it's a fairly easy step. If you haven't started using Copilot, the thing to do is you want to select a small team, 4 to 6 people, deploy Copilot licenses just for those people. You could have an organization with 1,000 people in it, but no, you just want to do that Copilot. You want to start building your AI engine in your 365 tenant, build that index, and then you want to start learning how to think outside the box. And this is really, there's different terms of thinking outside the box, but really what this is all about is creative thinking. And think about when you're going through school, for instance, on high school and college, you were actually in a chemistry class or a physics class, and you always would have to do these hypotheses. Those are basically what we think of prompts. And you think of how you want to have questions answered and how you want the information displayed. Now, what Microsoft has done, they created this Copilot lab called copilot.cloud.microsoft.com that gives you an idea of how to actually train yourself, because that's what we need to do as leaders in organizations.
Introducing Copilot Lab to help everyone learn to work iteratively with AI and get the most out of Microsoft 365 Copilot. Copilot Lab is a place to experiment, to learn the art and science of prompting, how to turn a good prompt into a great one. Share your favorite prompts with coworkers and get inspired as we all learn to work in a whole new way together.
And that's the key part when you talk about Copilot. It's about the prompts. It's about understanding and learning how to prompts and learning to become good at doing prompting. And it doesn't matter if you're using Copilot Security, Copilot for Sales, Copilot for Service. It doesn't really matter. It's about changing the way we do things and starting thinking outside the box. So where you start with Copilot, get that group put in place, and basically get that group initially put in place, and then go start experimenting. Learn the prompting from Copilot and learn how to actually get the information. It's a science, and it evolves, it's constantly adapting, and you have to learn it. And part of the issue with 365, why it's important to get started, is you really want to build your organization. You want to build that semantic index in your organization so you get that relationship put in place. That's super, super critical. Now you can start today, use Copilot. We have a couple things. Copilot License and Test Group, it's an annual subscription. It's $30 per user per month. So it's paid up front, $360 for the paid up front for 12 months. We have a Copilot white paper. If you go select the KAMIND.com feedback, just go put your name in there. We'll give you access into the white paper so we'll give you a copy of it. And really, it's start the learning process. And that's super, super important. This is something that you don't want to kick the can down the road. You need to start to build the index in your organization, and you need to start learning. Because if you don't start the learning, you're going to find out your competitors are, and they're going to be a step ahead. And it's important that you basically get on the track and figure out the strategy, start figuring out what you need to do. And before you can figure out the security pieces of it, you got to start using it to see what you can actually have. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions to see if anyone has questions, and see what we can address. One of the things that we found on April 1st, Microsoft's going to be releasing Copilot Security. And there's a couple of different versions of it that you'll see, but it's going to be, at KAMIND, we have a product called Guard Plus, which is used for the data analytics and data collection. We designed it specifically looking at how to collect large data to figure out how we can actually do better analysis of what's going on with our clients. These are things that we're looking in terms of how do we integrate this? How do we actually integrate the different pieces? As you look in each of your organizations, you need to look at it from how do I want to use these things to basically build a better company and build better productivity for ourselves. It looks like we don't have any questions. So what I'll do is we'll bring this meeting to a conclusion. So we'll give you back 20 minutes of your time. And I thank you very much for your attending today. And we'll have our next Copilot session, which will be in around April, I think it's April 18th. And let's see, there's someone is actually typing a quick question in here. So, and yeah, thank you, Rusty. Yeah, it's good. Seriously, everyone, main message, start using Copilot today and learn it and learn the prompting and learning the pieces that you need to do to actually move yourself forward. Thanks again for attending, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
because you already have, you both use Okta